Dr. Richard Carrier, I have an anonymous supporter who does not like to be mentioned or known to the world.
Sure, all right.
He is part of my mystery cult, and you have to gain initiation.
Right. Yeah. A certain level of initiation, not even basic. Right?
Yeah, you got to really pay those indulgences to make it in there. So, two questions. What are the Pseudo-Clementine writings? Specifically the homilies and the recognitions, do they provide much evidence about the Jewish Christians who refuse to follow Paul's teachings?
Okay, I can't really answer this well. The reason being is that when I looked into this literature and discovered that it's all late and forged, I just didn't use it. So I haven't really extensively studied the scholarship on this, but there are, so for First Clement, for example, I think is an authentic letter written before the Jewish War. But now there's other letters by Clement that are forgeries, that they're written in a different style, they're not by the same author, and they're written long, long later. And yes, then there's these really weird long homilies and recognitions and things like that have a lot of strange statements in them. The problem is these are really hard to date, and they're really hard to source. Like, what sources are they using? So it's really hard to figure out the answer to this question. Now, whether it's possible for a scholar to go in and dig and come up with something solid, I can't answer that, because when I looked at it and saw how messed up it was and how unreliable it was as a source, I chose not to use it. So I've not dived into that literature. There probably are other scholars who have, and it'd be interesting if you could find one of them and get them on your show to talk about it, because a lot of people don't know about this literature, because it is some of the weirdest Christian literature there is, and it has a lot of strange things in it. So if there are any scholars who actually specialize in it, like PhDs who've done it, I guarantee you they will make a good interview, because there is some fascinating, strange stuff in this. And then they could probably answer a question like this more competently than I can.
That's what I want. I want to get someone who specializes in it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've heard that there's like polemics, invented narratives of like Peter arguing with Paul, pretty much saying, dude, you had now this shows you it's late in the game as well.
Well, there's a lot of stuff about Simon Magus, and the there's different weird sects. That's another thing, is we get information from the Clementines about supposedly these other Jewish sects that might even intersect with the earlier question we were talking about the other Jesus cults, but it's vague, it's poorly sourced, it's not a reliable source, it's late. So it's a mess, it's vexed. And so I have avoided this as a subject of study. So I would be interested in hearing an interview of someone who's done the opposite and dove in and made it their specialty.
Well, maybe we can make that happen here. I hope to find them. Also, did this group who believed in adoptionism have a better insight on who Jesus really was, since it appears some of them actually knew him while he was alive and heard him preach?
I don't believe any of those stories. So that's all late legend stuff. And adoptionism specifically, the specific dispute, called adoptionism, that actually caused an issue, is also late, right? So we're talking after the 2nd century even. So we're already so far removed from the origins of Christianity. And when you look at authors who claim to be trying to dig at the origins of Christianity, at their own history, Papias, even Eusebius, when you look at Eusebius, they have no information. There's nothing. I don't know why this is the case, but there's no they have no archives. There's no data that they have, and all they're doing is repeating weird rumors and stuff. So no, I don't think the adoptionists knew anything like that. What the adoptionists were doing eventually is taking the texts literally as they were written. And if you read Mark, Mark is totally adoptionist in the sense that Jesus only technically becomes the Son of God at the moment that God says, I'm adopting you. Yeah. That's Mark's version. Now, Mark is writing, he doesn't want you to take it literally, right? So what he's writing doesn't necessarily mean that's what he believes. So for instance, the baptism scene in Mark is just an etiological myth for baptism for Christians. So Jesus undergoes baptism to be adopted by God because that's what Christians do, right? So it's just a symbol of that. Whether Mark had the metaphysical belief that this is the only moment when Jesus became the Son of God, that's a much harder question to answer, because that's not how Mark is writing. When you look at Paul, clearly he does believe that Jesus is in some sense always has been the firstborn son of God. But something important happened when he went through this ordeal. And the ordeal kind of reverses the ordeal of Satan, where Satan wants to claim the power of God and then he becomes fallen. God gives the war in heaven, etc. Jesus refuses to claim the power of God, descends into the lowest possible depths as possible, and dies and self-sacrifices and all of that, and then gets exalted. Is the exaltation a return to a previous status, or is it an exaltation to a higher status? That is hard to answer because it's not it's one of those questions where the way they write is very vague about this, and you want to just ask them for clarification, but unfortunately we can't do that.
Bart tries to say that he was above the language in the Greek in Philippians. He says, of course, the pre-existence is there, and that's he accepts that full out. But then he says, then he was made higher than he was.
Yeah, and you can get a hint of this in 1 Corinthians 15, where when Paul goes into how God gives Jesus all these powers until everything is finished, and then Jesus is going to merge back with God, right? So there's a real hint there of the Jewish belief in the emanations, right? So the archangels are actually they were parts of God, and then God emanated them. And so they're kind of like little bots that he creates that run out and carry a part of his powers and go do things for him. But in the beginning, they were actually unified, but they weren't separate beings. They were him. And this is what you get in John, right? John 1, it's very key to notice, and people often don't notice this, is when it says the Logos, when Jesus was the Word of God and so forth, it says Jesus was God. It doesn't say Jesus is God. Right, so Trinitarians take it as an is, right? So he's always been coterminous with God. But no, John 1 is talking about standard philonic Jewish emanation theory, where everything started with there was just God, and then he pulled these pieces out of himself and turned them into archangels and gave them assignments and stuff. And so yes, they were at one point coterminous with God, but once they're out doing their own thing, they are a separate being. But they're still, in some sense, metaphysically connected to God as an emanation of him. This is normal Jewish theology at that time. That's not even radical or anything like that. So answering that question is difficult, because once you understand in the context of how Jews wrote about the sort of complex metaphysics of God and the angels and stuff, and then you look at the actual language being used by this, it's hard to pick apart different things. So Philo talks about the firstborn son of God, the Logos and all of this stuff, as though he's always had, and there's never been a moment when he's been more exalted, he's the most exalted of all the angels. And that's kind of like Hebrews says, that he's exalted above all the angels. And that's just like Philo's Logos, right? But when Paul's talking in 1 Corinthians 15, where it sounds like he's God is assigning more powers to Jesus as part of this big plan, where ultimately, eventually, when all is resolved, Jesus will just merge back with him, and then it'll just be God. That does allow room for maybe there was some sort of even more powers that God granted to Jesus at a certain point, and that the descent and self-sacrifice and so forth was kind of a test that God gave before he did it. If Satan came up to God and said, "Yeah, give me all these powers," God says, "No way." But Jesus goes, "You know what? I'm gonna humble myself and do all of this, and not try to claim the powers of God and so on." And then God goes, "You passed the test. I can trust you. I can give you more powers." Is that what they're talking about? I don't know, right? And so, this is vexed by the fact that this is a mystery cult, and even Paul himself says there's these mystery teachings that he can't talk about and so forth. Hebrews says this too. There's a certain amount of milk I can tell you about, but there's meat that's for adults, right? And so there's secret teachings we don't know, right? And those secret teachings are the easiest to change and be forgotten. So by the time you get to the 2nd century, when you get any other Christian writing, there's no certainty that they even know what Paul's secret teachings were at the time. So this is why it's vexing to try and answer this question. I don't know if it's answerable, really.
That's quite an interesting point you make. Paula Fredrickson talks about how quickly Christians abused Paul's words and kind of went beyond him. Paul does weird shit. We both agree, outright. And one of the weird things I find that's weird to me may not be...
I have to say, honestly, all Christian writers in the ancient world...
This is true.
There's tons of weird stuff. But anyway, go on.
I'm just when I look at him... All right, this is a good point. When I see him do that thing with Abraham, and that these people are becoming in Christ as a single singular seed of Abraham.
Yeah,
Like he does this really convoluted argument in Galatians 3 to make the Gentiles also children of Abraham. But what I was getting at is like, he's already, by doing what he's doing, I don't think he sees the replacement theology that was coming. Like everything's a bit, what is that called? We call it replacement theology full on, but the cessation of some, he doesn't, I don't think he gets like this Jewishness he's really getting rid of by doing this. And it becomes something radically different in no time.
That's right. Yeah. No, I think that's true. Yeah, Paul didn't foresee it. In the same way that Mark didn't foresee that people would claim that the body was stolen from the tomb. So then that gets the response to him, and then Matthew has to respond to that. Mark didn't foresee like, oh yeah, that kind of looks like they stole a body, didn't it?
Yeah, but what can you imagine a hypothetical conversation where Mark goes, "No, you idiot! Haven't you read the other Greco-Roman myths where he becomes a god? Why would they need to steal his body? He became a god. His body was missing for a reason. Like,
right.
Like you don't get the point, Matthew. Like that would be it'd be funny to find.
Well, that certainly Mark and Matthew would be in opposite sides. They're opponents, really, because they're defending two separate factions of Christianity. And what we're just talking about, Matthew is the Torah observant Christianity, does not like the Pauline Christianity that lets Gentiles in without converting. And Mark is totally a Pauline sect document where it's totally in favor of Gentiles becoming saved without converting to Judaism. So yeah, they're already, like Matthew wrote specifically like to attack Mark in a way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's going on as well. But I would love to have more access to the weird, even if it's weird. I'd love to know like more about what they were actually thinking a lot of the time.
I'm with you 100%. Thank you to our private, anonymous, secret society, 7th tier Illuminati supporter. You know who you are. But seriously, thank you for that and for those questions and your continued support here at MythVision when we need you most. And I really do appreciate that. I don't need to tell you, but those who are watching this video, join the Patreon, help support us, help support Dr. Carey. He has many books, and he's got a blog. He's got all sorts of stuff that you can get in on. And on the blog, if you pay, you can leave comments through the Patreon. I believe it's Patreon or PayPal.
Yeah, you can do both. Okay. If you do PayPal, you have to tell me that you've done it. That's why you did it, right? PayPal or Patreon members, let me know, and I can put you on a whitelist where your comments on my blog post immediately. You don't go to comment moderation. Everybody else sits in comment moderation, and I'm a busy guy, so comments can sit in there for a while. But if you're a supporting member either through PayPal or through Patreon, you get on that whitelist, and then you can actually post. And
you can also ask questions. And when he has time, which it's very rare, but he does from time to time.
I get to things eventually. Yeah,
you do eventually.
It takes a while, but I do.
You can ask Dr. Carey and then go from there. I really appreciate you. Thank you, Dr. Carey.